Hey, welcome back to the Coin Box. This is video number 2 in my series on the Mexican onza and its varieties. So today we're taking a look at the 1978 onzas. But before we begin, take a second to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell icon to be notified of future uploads. Alright, let's get started. If we revisit our onza timeline from my last video, we can see that 29 years went by between the first onza in 1949 and the 1978 onza, which is a really long time. So you might be wondering why there were no onzas minted for nearly 3 decades. Well, at first that might sound crazy, but there are 2 things that I'd like to point out here. First, remember that in the global context of silver bullion coinage, the trio of onzas issued in 1978, 79, and 80 still precede any other modern world silver bullion coin we now have. In other words, it's not like other countries were issuing silver bullion coins and Mexico wasn't. Nobody else was either, and on the contrary, being the world's largest silver producer, Mexico is at the forefront of the 1-ounce silver world bullion coin production wave, beginning with the 92% silver onzas and continuing with the 3/9 fine silver Libertads shortly after, both of which were the first of their kind in the world. Second, even though most other countries, including the United States, phased out silver from their circulating coinage in the 1960s, Mexico continued issuing silver coins for general circulation throughout the 60s and 70s, concluding with the silver 100 peso coins from 1977, 78, and 79. So there was a relatively continuous output from the Mexican mint of silver coins available to the public between the 1949 onza and the 1978 onza. So Mexico had a much more seamless transition from silver coins in circulation to silver bullion when compared to the US, for example, which had a large gap between the 40% silver 1969 Canadian half dollar and the 1986 American silver eagle. So both of those points might help explain the gap between onza production. As for the when and why behind the production of the 1978 onzas, it's been near impossible to find any kind of official document, numismatic article, or contemporaneous information of any kind that mentions the release of the onzas. But I was able to find this one news article titled "Silver Coins Will Be Minted as Troy Ounces" from the Mexican press that reports on some key information I want to share with you. It was written in Mexico City on the 22nd and published in Guadalajara on the 23rd of February 1979. It reads, "Silver coins, which in the past were a symbol of the peso's stability and a popular means of savings, are being minted again, now as a troy ounce. Priced at 205 pesos per unit, they will be available for purchase starting next Monday at the Numismatic Museum of the Bank of Mexico." First off, it's very interesting that they weren't issued until early 1979. Based on this article, the issue date was Monday, February 26, 1979, at an issue price of 205 pesos, which was about $9 at the time. In a sense, this coin replaces the 100 peso silver coin, which was minted and circulated from March 1st, 1977 to February 1st of this year, 1979. The timeline here is very interesting because if accurate, it means that even though the dates are different on the 1978 onzas and on the 1979 100 pesos coins, in reality, the 78 onzas were released after the 79 100 pesos. So again, we see that relatively seamless transition from silver circulation coinage to silver bullion coinage that we were talking about. We could speculate that the 280,000 1978 onzas were minted in the last few weeks of 1978, and that the 780,000 1979 100 pesos were minted in early January 1979, and then simply released in reverse order. Both issues have the lowest mintage of their respective series. The article continues, "The minting of the troy ounce was ordered by President José López Portillo in a directive addressed to David Ibarra Muñoz, Secretary of the Treasury, and Gustavo Romero Colbeck, Director of the Bank of Mexico, fulfilling a promise made upon taking office to return to the peso fuerte, which was the 90% silver peso similar to the 8 real. This proposal came during a time of economic turmoil and inflation, and was perhaps an attempt to stabilize the currency, although the proposal never came to pass, and instead it was apparently deemed fulfilled by ordering the production of the onza, even though it was not a legal tender coin. The design of these pieces, which are not legal tender coins, is inspired by the Mexican troy ounce minted in 1949, which circulated only that year with a total mintage of 1 million pieces. There are 3 known patterns for the 1978 onza. The first is essentially the same design as the 1949 onza, just with an updated date, which personally I really like. Although the second pattern design is my favorite because it has a knuckle joint coin press, which would have been really cool because it would have matched the original 1936 medal that I mentioned in my previous video on the 1949 onza. The third pattern was the Xochipilli statue, which I'm glad they didn't go with since it doesn't match the screw press design, so I think it would have resulted in a disconnected design and theme. Pablo Luna mentions in his 20th Century Patterns book that he was told that all three of these patterns had restrikes in the 80s, which were essentially capricho medals, which is interesting because I did find images of nicer, frostier pieces, which I'm guessing could be the restrikes. Notice the missing pattern inscription on the nicer examples. So in the end, what design changes were made to the new onza? Well, we can see the sequence from the 1947 pattern to the 1949 onza, which the 1978 pattern was based off of, and then the adjustments made to the final design of the 1978 onza. There were basically two changes made to the design on the obverse. The date was changed from the larger font, which followed the curvature of the coin, like we also saw in the pattern, to a horizontal date with smaller font floating to the left of the coin press. And then the mint mark was moved to the reverse, where we actually find most of the design changes. But besides the addition of the mint mark and the removal of the star and the equals 480 grains, the changes have more to do with an adjusted layout than with the actual inscriptions themselves, since the information is the same. Also, you might remember that I mentioned in my previous video that the 1949 onza had the metal alignment, while the next three onzas in the series all have the coin alignment. A phrase I see used very often by dealers is that the 1978 onza is scarcer and more sought after than the 1949 onza, and that it's the scarcest date in the series. But as you know, total mintage is not the only factor that determines a coin's rarity, demand, or even current availability. So is it really true that the 1978 onza is scarcer and more sought after than the 1949 onza? Well, let's look at the data and compare the two. At both NGC and PCGS, there are more 1949 onzas graded than 1978 onzas. So you might assume that that proves that the 78s are scarcer simply because there are fewer graded. But that's not necessarily the case because the total number graded is only one factor. Keep in mind that generally speaking, the scarcer a coin is, and the more collector demand there is for it, the more likely it is to be sent in for grading. So instead of just looking at the total number graded, let's compare the condition between the 2 years. Because I think a more important question is which date is harder to find in excellent condition, or in high grades? Well, at NGC, out of the 540 1949s, there are only 18 graded MS66, which is the top pop with none higher. That's roughly 3% in high grade. At PCGS, there are 19 onzas with a grade of MS66 and above, including one MS67, which is the sole top pop, which comes out to 6% of those submitted. Let's compare those numbers to the 1978s. At NGC, 10% or 41 onzas graded MS66 or above, including two MS67s. And at PCGS, a whopping 37% or 84 onzas have been graded MS66 or higher, including 9 MS67s. So just to be clear, across both grading companies, even though there are more 1949s graded than 1978s, nearly 20% of all 1978s are in top grades, compared to less than 5% of 1949s in top grades. So if we're talking about availability of these onzas in great condition, I think the data speaks for itself, and we can pretty confidently come to the conclusion that even though the 1978 onzas have the lowest mintage of the series, the 1949 onzas are still much harder to find in high grades. I think the logical explanation for this is that the 1949 onzas have been around for 76 years, whereas the 78s have been available for 46 years. Obviously, the more time goes by, the harder it gets to preserve a piece in its original condition. On top of that, consider that for nearly 30 years, the 1949 onzas were the only 1-ounce silver bullion coin available for just about anyone to buy, sell, collect, or even melt. Over the span of 3 decades, there's no telling how many onzas were melted down for jewelry, or simply damaged or lost before the 1978 onzas were even introduced. So it makes sense that the survival rate in high grades is quite low. There are two very well-known varieties of the 1978 onza. PCGS uses the Type 1 and Type 2 designations, while NGC uses the Casa de Moneda wide and close designations, which I like much better. In this video series, I prefer to use designations that describe the variety rather than by type, because if I say Type 1, you have to go look that up and memorize what that means and what that's referring to. Whereas if I say wide spacing or close spacing on Casa de Moneda, that's pretty self-explanatory, and you can see for yourself what that's referring to and know which design I'm talking about. As a side note, I've always thought it was strange for the Onza series to be categorized by type. It just seems to make more sense to use type to refer to a design change within the same year, like with the 1991 Libertads and the 2021 American Silver Eagles. So it makes sense for there to be a Type 1 and Type 2 1978 Onza. But then why is the 1979 Onza a Type 3? It's literally the same design as the Type 2. And even if it was a new or different design, nobody refers to the 1996 Libertad redesign as a Type 3, right? And if you're going to continue using type for every year and the 1979 Onza is Type 3, then why isn't the original 1949 Onza the Type 1? So anyway, in my view, it makes no sense for PCGS or anyone else for that matter to refer to them by type. And I'm glad NGC uses descriptive variety designations instead. So let's review how to identify both varieties previously mentioned. The wide and narrow spacing refers to the space between the words Casa de Moneda de Mexico on the obverse. The quickest and easiest way I've found to identify them is by looking at the C in casa. If it's stuck to the coin press, it's the wide variety because logically, if there's wide spacing between words, the inscription takes up more space and nearly touches the coin press. If the C is separated from the coin press, it's the close spacing variety because the inscription is closer together, leaving more of a gap between the coin press arm and the C. So that's what I look for to quickly distinguish between the two varieties. As far as which variety is more common, I don't think there's much of a consensus on whether one variety is scarcer than the other. In my experience, they are both about equally available. It's interesting that on the reverse of all 1978 onzas on both varieties, for whatever reason, the right-hand pan and chains are doubled. The surrounding inscriptions and even the arm of the scale itself do not seem to be affected, so it would seem that just that element of the pan and the chains was repunched or hubbed more than once. Let's take a closer look at the wide spacing variety. At NGC there's a 7/7 variety which Scott Dahl worked hard to get recognized. You can see the doubling to the right of the 7 and slightly above it as well. Now I think it's pretty cool and I don't disagree with the attribution, but I will note that every single wide spacing onza I've seen has this doubling. In other words, it's probably the result of a repunched 7 on the master die. So I don't believe it should be in a separate category because all 1978 wide onzas have this 7/7 doubling. Another curious characteristic of this variety is this spike on the coin press, which we find on wide onzas, which is possibly the result of a gouge on the master die. On the reverse, there are 3 different categories I've found on my limited supply of wide variety onzas. The normal reverse, a DDR1 and a DDR2. The doubling occurs in slightly different directions. On the DDR1, the doubling is shifted down, and on the DDR2, the doubling is shifted to the left. The key areas to look for the doubling are in the words una onza and on the left-hand pan of the balance scale. So on the DDR1, you can see that the A in una is shifted down, so it's doubled here to its left. On the DDR2, the doubling is shifted left, which results in double corners at the base of the A. And with the proper lighting, you can make out both A's, one on top of the other. So if I cycle between the normal reverse and the DDR1, you can see how everything gets thicker and shifts downward. Again, here you can see the letters in una shifting down. The chains and the pan of the balance scale, and these 4 dots on the pan do as well. In my limited pool of onzas, the most common reverse was this DDR1 by far, even more common than the normal reverse. If we look at the DDR2 reverse, you can see how it shifts to the left. It's especially noticeable on the chains and on the 4 dots on the pan. Then if we move up to onza, both the O and Z show quite obvious doubling as well. Take a look at the Z. Once again, you can see double corners, and you can clearly make out both Z's from each hubbing of the die. So even though both the DDR1 and DDR2 are more subtle than some other double die coins out there, the doubling is definitely noticeable, especially when viewing under a loupe. Another wide spacing onza I wanted to show briefly is this one with a small die crack above moneda, which I think gives character to the piece. Although this isn't a variety, I still think it's something cool to keep an eye out for, as I've seen several others like it. And finally, another interesting onza to keep an eye out for is one with a proof-like finish, like this wide spacing variety in MS64. NGC has graded only one 1978 proof-like onza, but if there's one, then there are bound to be more out there waiting to be found. On the obverse of the close spacing variety, other than the differences we've already mentioned in the inscriptions, the coin press itself is slightly rounder than on the wide onzas. Another characteristic which is common to all close onzas that I've seen is this line to the right of the A in moneda. It's more obvious on some than on others, but it does seem to be on all close onzas, which would suggest it's what's referred to as reduction lathe doubling, which is why other letters are unaffected. On the reverse, besides the normal reverse, I found the exact same DDR1 die variety on the close spacing as on the wide spacing, which is kind of cool. I haven't found a DDR2 on the close onza yet, but I assume they're probably out there as well. As far as the current value of the 1978 onzas, depending on condition, you can find them for between $70 and $130 raw. Remember that when these were first issued over 45 years ago, they were being sold individually for about $9. Well, I hope you enjoyed this second video in my onza history and varieties series. Let me know in the comments below which of the 1978 onzas you have in your collection. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell icon to be notified of future uploads. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like and share it with a numismatic friend. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.